She buried him once. Not literally, not with a casket and flowers and a crowd of people dressed in black. She buried him the way you buried someone who disappeared without explanation, slowly, painfully, one memory at a time, until the place where he used to live inside her chest was nothing but quiet scar tissue. It took her 4 years. 4 years to stop reaching for a phone she couldn't call. For years to stop searching for a face she couldn't name in every crowded room she walked into. For years to convince herself that whatever she had lost it clean. That it was gone. That she was fine. She was 26 years old, and she had almost succeeded. The rain started at 8:30. Isabella Rossi noticed it the way she noticed most things these days. Distantly. The way you notice weather through glass. Something happening to a world she was observing rather than inhabiting. She pulled her coat tighter and pushed open the door of Hemingway and Rain, the small bookstore in East 74th that she had been coming to every Thursday for the past 2 years. Ever since the therapist she no longer saw had suggested she find a ritual that asked nothing of her. Bookstore had seemed safe enough. The bell above the door chimed softly. The smell hit her first old paper and cedar, and something faintly like cinnamon from the candle burning near the register. Jazz drifted from a small speaker somewhere above the shelves. Low and unhurried, the kind of music that didn't ask you to feel anything in particular. She exhaled. There were 4 other people inside. An elderly couple near the history section, moving with a particular slowness of people who had nowhere else to be and found this beautiful. A young woman at the register, half asleep over a paperback. A man near the fireplace, head tilted back in the armchair, softly and completely unconscious. And him. She noticed him because he hadn't moved. Not in a time it took her to find her usual corner. Not in the 12 minutes she spent reading the back covers of novels she had no intention of purchasing. Not in the slow, aimless wandering she did between shelves when she was avoiding going home to an apartment that was perfectly comfortable and entirely empty. Darsuda. Black gloves that made no sense in a bookstore this warm. A face with a kind of angular stillness you associated with paintings rather than people beautiful in the precise, geometric way of something that had been constructed rather than grown. He was holding a book he hadn't opened once, and he was watching her dot knot with the idle attention of a bored man, not the brief, flickering curiosity that strangers sometimes gave each other in small, warm rooms on rainy evenings. He was watching her with complete, unbroken, terrifying focus. The way you watched something you had traveled a very long distance to see, and were now quietly, privately confirming was real. Isabella looked away. Her heart had begun moving at a speed she didn't approve of. She moved to a different aisle. He didn't follow, but when she glanced back through the gap in the shelves, he had turned slightly. Just enough so that he was still looking at her. She told herself it was nothing. Men looked at women in bookstores. It was entirely ordinary. It meant nothing at all. She repeated this to herself for the next 8 minutes while pretending to read a novel about French cooking, her eyes moving across sentences that didn't reach her brain. When she finally looked up again, he was gone. The relief that moved through her was immediate and profound and lasted exactly 12 seconds. Because when Isabella stepped out of the bookstore into the rain, pulling her hood up against the cold, and already thinking about the subway in her empty apartment, and the leftover soup she would eat alone in front of the television, a black umbrella lifted slowly beside her. She went still. You shouldn't. And walk home alone this late. His voice was low, controlled. The kind of voice that had learned, somewhere along the way, to carry weight without raising itself. Isabella turned very slowly. Up close, he was worse. Not violent. Nothing about him suggested violence exactly. It was something more unsettling than that. He had the quality of a man who was maintaining himself with extreme discipline. The way you maintained a structure you knew was capable of something enormous. Something that would require every wall you had ever built around it to stay precisely in place, His eyes were dark, patient, ancient in a way that didn't match the apparent youth of his face. "I'm fine." "Isabella Suide." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank you." He didn't move. His gaze moved across her face with a slowness that felt less like looking and more like remembering. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." The words weren't threatening. They weren't even unkind. They carried the particular weight of a true thing said by someone who had thought about it for a very long time. Isabella's spine straightened. "You don't know me." Something moved behind his eyes. Not agreement, not grief. "Do I know you?" she asked, though the question came out before she had decided to ask it. Not because she believed the answer was yes. She was certain she had never met this man. Certain in the way you were certain about things that should have been impossible to forget, but because something was happening beneath the surface of her memory. Some low, seismic tremor she couldn't name. Like standing over a fault line and feeling it shift under your feet without breaking. His expression changed. Not surprise, not guilt. Pain, quiet and devastating and controlled, the kind of pain a person had learned to wear so long it had become a second face. It lasted less than a second before restraint pulled it back under, but she saw it. She had the unsettling feeling that she was meant to see it. "You did once," he said, "Dot." The world around her stopped breathing. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was now finally, irreversibly inside it. He held out a photograph. Isabella didn't take it immediately. She looked at his gloved hand, at the photograph between his fingers, at the edges worn soft from years of handling the way you wore down something you had held every day for a very long time. She took it. A frozen lake in winter, gray sky, bare trees at the edges of the frame, two children standing close together at the water's edge, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had not yet learned to be careful about what her face showed the world. Beside her, a teenage boy of perhaps 15 or 16, dog-haired, one arm hovering near her shoulder, in the instinctive protective posture of someone who had appointed himself responsible for another person's safety. Isabella stared at the photograph. The girl was her. She knew it with absolute certainty. The dark curls, the gap-toothed smile she recognized from her mother's photo albums, the red coat she could suddenly feel on her body as clearly as if she were wearing it right now, the specific weight of wool over small shoulders the boy. She stared at the boy. She didn't know his face. She couldn't place him. And yet, standing here in the rain, holding this photograph, something inside her chest was pulling toward him the way iron pulled toward a magnet. Not thought, not recognition. Something older and more unreasonable than either dot written across the bottom of the photograph in faded blue ink, in the careful cursive of a child. Isabella's hands were not entirely steady. She looked up at him. "My name is Lucien Moreau," he said quietly. And there it was, the thing she hadn't expected, the thing that undid the careful, rational architecture she had been building inside herself for the past 5 minutes. The name moved through her like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Not recognition of the man. Recognition of the name. Something buried so deep under years of forgetting that it should have been unreachable, but apparently wasn't. Apparently nothing was unreachable if the right person stood close enough and said it. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "I've had it since I was 16. The rain came down between them. "I don't remember you," she said. It came out like an apology. "I know," he said. "You were 7. There was an accident the following winter. Your parents moved you to New York after—" She paused. "You had a concussion. The doctors said the memory loss was—" He stopped, looked away for just a moment. "They said it was common with children." Isabella was very quiet. Her childhood before New York was not a blank exactly. It was more like a room she'd always known was there, but could never quite find the door to. She had stopped trying years ago. Her mother had always said there was nothing important in there. Just ordinary childhood things. Nothing worth the effort of recovering. "What was I to you?" she asked. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. "You were the first person," he said simply, "who was ever kind to me." She didn't go home with him. She wasn't reckless. She was a 26-year-old woman, alone in Manhattan with a stranger who had just produced evidence of a shared childhood she couldn't verify. And no matter what her chest was doing, her brain was still operational. She gave him nothing except her coffee order. They sat across from each other at a small table in the corner of a cafe, 2 blocks from the bookstore. Rain still falling outside. The city moving past the windows with its usual absolute indifference. Lucien held his espresso without drinking it. Isabella wrapped both hands around her cup and tried to organize her thoughts into something that resembled composure. "Tell me," she said. He told her. His mother had worked for her father's company in Lyon. This was how they had met, the way children met when the adults around them were briefly in the same place. They had spent 1 winter together. 3 months. He was 15 and practically feral, with a childhood that had taught him trust was something people used before they took things from you. And she was 7 and completely unaware of this, and had simply decided, with the absolute authority of a small child, that he was her friend. "You used to bring me food," he said. His voice was careful, clinical, almost, in the way people described things they had felt too deeply for too long and had learned to discuss at a distance. "From your kitchen. You thought I wasn't eating enough. You were completely right. You used to stand outside the staff quarters and knock and hand me things wrapped in napkins like you were delivering supplies to someone in a very serious situation." Isabella felt something shift in her chest. "You were so certain about everything," he continued. "Every day you had a new plan, new things to show me, new demonies. You informed me once, very seriously, that I was going to be your best friend, whether I wanted to be or not, and that I should simply accept this because you had already decided." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. It didn't belong there. It looked like a visitor from a different version of him. Someone who had been allowed to exist briefly before being put away. "The day before the accident," he said, "you made me promise to wait for you." Isabella looked down at the photograph still in her hands. "You said you were going to grow up," Lucien said, "and come back. And that I needed to be there when you did. Ah, Pawsey. You were 7 years old and completely serious. I told you I would." "You kept the promise," Isabella said slowly. "For how long?" 11 years, to find out what happened to you after the accident. For more, to find you." The words landed quietly. 15 years. The number sat between them like a third presence at the table. "Why?" Isabella asked. It came out, barely above a whisper. "Why would you? I was a child. We knew each other for 3 months. Why would you? Because nobody had ever—" He stopped. The careful control in his voice fractured. Just slightly. Just enough for her to see the fault lines beneath it before it sealed itself back up. "In 15 years of looking for people who were worth looking for, I only ever found one. The cafe was warm around them. Outside, Manhattan moved on." Isabella stared at the man across from her, the dark eyes, the careful hands, the face of someone who had spent so many years holding something tightly that releasing even a fraction of it was physically visible. She didn't know him. She needed to be honest with herself about that. The boy in the photograph was a stranger wearing a face she couldn't verify. The story he was telling her was one she had no way to confirm tonight. In a cafe, in the rain, with her heart behaving irrationally and her instincts telling her 2 completely different things simultaneously. But the name sat in her chest like an ember that had been buried under ash for years and had just been given the first breath of air it had felt in a very long time. She picked up her coffee. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning." Lucien Moreau looked at her across the small table as if she had just handed him something he had walked 15 years to receive, and he began. His childhood was the kind you didn't describe. 2 people you wanted to keep. He told it plainly. No performance of suffering, no reaching for sympathy, no pauses designed to land on the listener in a particular way. He told it the way you reported whether this happened, then this, then this. Lucien Moreau had grown up moving between the shadows of other people's houses, his mother employed, his father absent in the permanent way of men who had never intended to stay. He had learned very early that warmth was conditional, and that the condition was usually someone else's convenience. He was not angry about this, or rather, he had been, once, with the totality and ferocity available only to teenage boys who had been failed comprehensively, and had converted that anger into something harder and more useful. Discipline, control, the ability to exist in any room without needing anything from it. What he had not accounted for was a 7-year-old girl with dark curls and a red coat who had apparently not received the information that he wasn't available. You came back every day, he said. No matter what, I said. No matter what I did. You were completely impervious. He turned the espresso cup slightly on its saucer. I told you once that I didn't want a friend. You looked at me for a very long time. Then you said, that's fine. I'll be a friend for you until you want one. And you left. And then you came back the next morning at exactly the same time with food wrapped in a napkin. Isabella pressed her lips together. She didn't have the memory, but she had something else. The strong, irrational conviction that this was true. Not because she could verify it, but because it sounded exactly like something she would do. The lake, she said, touching the photograph. Tell me about this. The first real stillness moved across his face. It was the last week before Christmas. The grounds of the estate had a lake that froze every winter. You wanted to see it. I took you there early one morning before the stuff would up. His eyes moved to the photograph briefly. You thought it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. You stood at the edge for almost an hour, just looking. Isabella looked at the little girl in the photograph, the complete, unguarded joy on that small face. Who took the picture? She asked. I did. Applausi. Then you took it from me and took one of both of us and wrote that on the back. I didn't know you'd done it until you handed it to me. What did you do? Something moved through his expression. Careful, held, enormous. I kept it, he said simply. The silence between them was different now. Less the silence of 2 strangers and more the silence of something being carefully, mutually acknowledged. After the accident, Lucien said, your father moved you to New York within a month. My mother's contract ended. I had no way to contact your family. I was 15 years old with no money and no access and no... He stopped. I was 15. I had nothing. But you looked anyway, Isabella said. Eventually. When I had the means, too. His jaw tightened slightly. By the time I found you, you were 22 in college. I watched you from a distance for some time. I needed to know that you were. He paused on the word. Well, something cold moved through Isabella's chest. How long? She asked carefully. How long did you watch from a distance? He met her eyes without flinching. 4 years, he said. The cafe felt very small suddenly. You've been watching me, Isabella said slowly, for 4 years, without approaching me. Without, I didn't want to disrupt your life, but you disrupted it tonight. Yes. What change? Lucien set down his espresso cup. He looked at her with a kind of directness that most people spent their whole lives learning to avoid. You looked at me, he said. In the bookstore tonight, you looked directly at me, and for a moment, just a moment, something moved across your face. Not recognition. Something before recognition. Something underneath it. Isabella didn't speak. I have been waiting, he said quietly. For that look for 15 years. She went home alone. He didn't ask to walk her. He didn't offer again. He simply rose when she rose, held her coat As she shrugged it on a gesture so naturally courteous, it disarmed her more than anything he had said, and walked her to the door of the cafe, and stopped there. "I'll be at the bookstore," he said, "next Thursday. If you want to talk, not a request, not pressure, just information," offered, and then left alone. Isabella walked home in the rain. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a brownstone, on East 81st, a good apartment, a careful apartment, full of the particular order of someone who lived alone by preference, and had arranged everything exactly as they wanted it, and then found, in the silence of a Tuesday night, that they had arranged themselves straight out of needing anyone. She took off her coat. She sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of her and looked at it for a very long time. She called her mother at 11 p.m. "Bella?" Her mother's voice was surprised and slightly alarmed. Late calls meant emergencies. "What's wrong?" "The years before New York," Isabella said. "Before the accident." "Tell me about them." A silence. Not the silence of a woman trying to remember. The silence of a woman deciding what to say. "There's nothing to tell, sweetheart. You were very young. We moved and you were." "Mama?" Isabella kept her voice very steady. "Did we live in Lyon?" A longer silence. For a time, her mother's voice had taken on a quality Isabella recognized, careful, surface smooth, the vocal equivalent of a closed door. "Papa had a contract there. We were only there for the winter. And there was a boy." Isabella looked at the photograph. "A teenage boy from the staff quarters. I used to bring him food." The silence this time was very long. "Where's this coming from?" "Answer me, Mama." Her mother exhaled. The specific exhale of someone releasing something they had held compressed for a very long time. "There was a boy," she said quietly. "You were very attached to him. When we left, you were devastated. You asked about him for months. After the accident and the memory loss, your father and I," she paused, "we decided it was better not to bring it back. You were so young, Bella. We didn't want to confuse you with things from a life you no longer remembered. We thought." "You erased him," Isabella said. "We protected you." "From what?" Her mother didn't answer immediately. "He was a difficult boy," she said finally, withdrawn. "Angry. The staff were concerned about how much time he spent with you. Your father didn't think it was appropriate for a child your age to be so attached to someone like she stopped." "Someone like what?" "Mama." Silence. "Good night, Bella." The line went quiet. Isabella set down her phone. She looked at the little girl in the photograph, at the gap-toothed grin, the absolute unself-conscious joy of a child who had not yet been taught what was appropriate, at the teenage boy beside her, standing close with that instinctive protective posture, and something in his expression, something she hadn't clocked at first. Something that became visible only when you looked at it long enough. He was looking at the camera, but his body was angled toward the little girl. Like everything in him was pointed in her direction. Like even at 15, in a life that had given him very few things worth pointing himself toward, she was what he was using as North Dot. Isabella pressed her fingers against her eyes. She thought about a man sitting across from her in a cafe, describing a child who had brought him food wrapped in napkins and informed him that he was going to be her friend, whether he wanted to be or not. She thought about 4 years of watching from a distance because he didn't want to disrupt her life. She thought about the name Lucien and the way it had moved through her the moment he said it. Like water finding the shape of something it had always been meant to. She was 26 years old, and she had spent 4 years convincing herself she was fine. Sitting alone at her kitchen table at midnight with a photograph of herself at 7 years old, she understood, with the quiet devastation of someone who had just found the door to a room they'd always known was there. She had never been fine. She had simply been waiting. Without knowing what for she went back, she told herself She was going for the bookstore. She had been going every Thursday for 2 years. She had a routine. It had nothing to do with. And then she stopped lying to herself, somewhere around East 72nd Street, and simply walked. He was there, standing in the same aisle. But this time, he wasn't pretending to read. He was simply standing, hands in his coat pockets, watching the door, watching for her, making no effort to perform anything else. Something moved through Isabella when she saw him, recognition that didn't have its roots in memory, the kind that came from somewhere older and more unreasonable. She woke to him. "I spoke to my mother," she said. He said nothing, waited. She confirmed it. "Lion. The winter, the accident." She paused. "She confirmed you." Still, he didn't speak. His eyes were very steady on hers. "I've been trying to remember," Isabella said, "all week. I've been looking at the photograph and trying to pull something back, and it isn't there. Whatever was there is gone." She looked at him. "I don't know you. I want you to understand that. I can't give you a reunion. I don't have the memory to participate in." "I know that," he said, quietly. "But—" She stopped. He waited with the infinite patience of a man who had already practiced waiting longer than most people managed anything. "I want to know you now," Isabella said. "If you're willing to be known by someone who is starting from nothing, someone who can't give you what you lost, someone who might be an entirely different person from the child you remember." Lucien was quiet for a long time. "She wasn't different from you," he said finally. "She was you. Just smaller and louder." "I'm still loud," Isabella said. "I know," he said. "I noticed." And for the first time, the very first time since she had seen him standing in an aisle with a book he never opened, something crossed Lucien Moreau's face that wasn't pain or patience or grief. Something that was almost carefully the beginning of peace. Isabella reached out and touched his arm. "Just briefly. Just enough. Buy me coffee," she said. "Tell me something else. Tell me something I don't know about the boy in the photograph." Lucien looked down at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. He was afraid of ice. He said quietly, "After your accident, he never walked on a frozen lake again." Isabella felt the words move through her like the sound of something setting itself back into place. "Tell me everything," she said. And this time she was ready to hear. The lake in the photograph still existed. It was smaller than Isabella had expected. Not the vast frozen expanse her imagination had constructed from a single, small image, but a quiet, private thing surrounded by bare trees, tucked into the grounds of an estate in Lyon that a man had quietly purchased 2 years ago and never quite explained why. She understood now. It was January. The surface had frozen perfectly, white and still, the kind of silence that had weight and texture and asked you to stand inside it for a moment before speaking. Lucien stood at the edge with his hands in his coat. Pockets, black coat, dark suit, a face that was still the most still face she had ever encountered, except that she could read it now. 6 months of learning to read him, 6 months of watching the controlled surface develop small openings. She recognized his trust, and she knew what she was looking at. He was afraid. Not of her. Of this. Of the ice. Of the version of this moment that had ended with a child lying unconscious in the snow, and a boy who had held her until the adults came and then been sent away and told to stay away. Isabella stepped beside him. She slipped her hand into his Dottie's fingers, closed around hers, carefully, with the controlled precision of a man who had learned not to hold things too hard after years of watching what he held disappear. "I'm still here," she said quietly. He looked at her, not with the watchful, patient hunger of the man in the bookstore, not with the grief of someone recounting a 15-year-old wound, with something she had no previous word for and had spent 6 months learning to name. "You came back," he said. "I promised I would," Isabella said. She had no memory of saying it. She had no memory of the frozen lake or the red coat or the napkin-wrapped food or the child she had been who had simply decided, with 7-year-old certainty, that this boy belonged to her. But she was here, standing at the edge of the same lake, holding the same handsome promises. It turned out didn't need memory to keep themselves. They just needed time.